Picture an ordinary Tuesday morning in Kyoto. It's 5:43 a.m. A 61-year-old man named Kenji opens his eyes a few seconds before the alarm rings. Not because he's unusually disciplined, not because he's forcing himself to wake up. His body simply knows it's time. Kenji isn't rich. He doesn't live in a minimalist magazine home. He has an ordinary job, a modest apartment, and a life that would look completely unremarkable from the outside. He has never downloaded a habit tracking app. He has never chased a miracle morning routine. He has never tried to optimize every hour of his day. Yet if you spent just one morning with him, you would notice something that is becoming surprisingly rare. He moves through life without hesitation. Not quickly, not slowly, just without resistance. He gets out of bed, folds his bedding, puts the kettle on, opens the window. Every movement arrives quietly, almost as if the next decision had already been made. And that's because, in many ways, it has. This is the part most people misunderstand. When you watch someone like Kenji, it looks like discipline. But what you're actually seeing is the absence of constant decision-making. Kenji isn't doing more than you. He's deciding less than you. Think about how most mornings begin. Before your feet even touch the floor, your brain has already started negotiating. Should I get up now? Maybe 5 more minutes. What's for breakfast? Where are my keys? Did I answer that email? I still need to finish what I started yesterday. One tiny decision becomes another, then another, then another. None of them feels important on its own, but together, they quietly drain something most people never realize they're spending. Attention, energy, self-control. By 9 o'clock, your day hasn't become difficult because you've worked hard. It has become difficult because you've already made dozens of unnecessary decisions. Kenji's mornings feel different for a simple reason. Most of those decisions disappeared years ago. Not through extraordinary discipline, not through stronger willpower, through repetition. The choices that still feel like effort to many people have become almost invisible to him. And here's the surprising part. None of the habits that shaped him were designed to make him more disciplined. They were designed to make daily life require less discipline in the first place. That single idea changes the way you see everything. Because maybe discipline isn't something you wake up and create every morning. Maybe it's something your environment quietly remembers for you. Maybe the calm you admire in other people has very little to do with motivation, and almost everything to do with the tiny decisions they stopped having to make years ago. Over the next few minutes, we're going to uncover 7 ordinary Japanese habits that do exactly that. They don't promise a new personality. They don't demand endless self-control. Instead, they quietly remove the invisible friction that makes everyday life feel heavier than it needs to be. And to understand why they work, we first have to question one of the most damaging ideas modern life has ever taught us about discipline, that the harder you force yourself, the more disciplined you become. For most of our lives, we've been taught to think about discipline in the same way. If you want better results, work harder, wake up earlier, resist temptation, push through discomfort, find more motivation, build stronger willpower. It sounds reasonable. In fact, most of the self-improvement industry is built on that idea. The assumption is simple. If you're struggling, you don't need a different system. You need to try harder. But what if that's only part of the story? What if the people who appear the most disciplined aren't winning because they're stronger, but because they're making fewer difficult decisions in the first place? Psychologists have spent decades studying something called behavioral automaticity. The idea is surprisingly simple. The more often you repeat the same behavior in the same situation, the less your brain has to negotiate with itself before doing it. At first, every habit feels like work. You remind yourself, you resist excuses, you push against old routines. But over time, something quietly changes. The argument inside your head becomes shorter, then quieter. Eventually, it almost disappears. The action doesn't become effortless because you suddenly developed extraordinary willpower. It becomes easier because your brain no longer treats it as a new decision. That's an important difference. Most people believe discipline means constantly winning an internal battle. But truly disciplined people may simply have fewer battles left to fight, and that changes the conversation completely. Modern self-improvement often asks us to make better decisions every single day. Japanese daily life, by contrast, has long emphasized something much quieter. It reduces how many decisions need to be made at all. That's why willpower, repetition, environment, and identity each play a different role. Willpower helps you do something once. Repetition makes it familiar. Your environment makes it easier. And eventually, your identity makes it feel natural. One small action stops feeling like something you force yourself to do. It simply becomes what you do. That may be the biggest misunderstanding about discipline. Discipline is not only the strength to choose wisely, it is the quiet architecture that makes the better choice feel ordinary. And once you begin to see discipline that way, you'll notice something fascinating. Kenji has been building that architecture for decades, starting in one of the most ordinary places imaginable, his dinner table. The first habit begins somewhere most of us would never expect, at the dinner table. In many parts of Japan, there is a traditional idea known as hara hachi bu. The phrase simply means eating until you're about 80% full. At first, it sounds like another rule about portion sizes, another strategy for weight control, but spend enough time watching people who practice it, and you begin to realize it teaches something much deeper. It teaches the ability to stop before the outside world tells you to, before the plate is empty, before your stomach feels completely full, before desire finally says, "That's enough." Imagine Kenji finishing dinner. There is one last bite of rice sitting quietly in his bowl. Nutritionally, it doesn't matter. One bite will not change his health. But psychologically, it changes everything. Nothing outside him is forcing the decision. No one is taking the bowl away. No timer has gone off. No rule says he has to stop. He simply does. Not because he lacks appetite, because he has practiced stopping. And that may be one of the most overlooked skills in modern life. Starting is easy. Almost anyone can begin. We start another episode, another scroll, another snack, another purchase, another argument, another hour of work. The difficult part is knowing when enough has quietly arrived. Stopping is its own skill, one that rarely receives the attention it deserves. Every time Kenji leaves that final bite behind, he reinforces a quiet message to himself. I don't have to obey every signal simply because it appears. That lesson reaches far beyond food. The same mind that can stop eating before excess is also learning to stop scrolling before midnight. Stop arguing after the important point has already been made. Stop buying things that solve yesterday's emotions instead of today's needs. Of course, hara hachibu is not a medical prescription, nor is it a guarantee of a longer life. Like many traditional practices, its value lies less in a promise and more in a perspective. It reminds us that moderation is something we practice, not something we magically possess. Perhaps that's why the final bite matters so much, because self-control is rarely built during life's dramatic moments. More often, it's built in the quiet moments that nobody else notices. And Kenji doesn't place those quiet boundaries only around what enters his body. He places another one at the entrance to his home. The second habit begins before Kenji even steps inside his home. Like millions of people across Japan, he removes his shoes at the door. On the surface, the reason seems obvious. Shoes carry dirt, dust, and everything they've picked up from the outside world. Leaving them at the entrance helps keep the living space clean. But after spending time in Japan, you begin to realize this small ritual is doing something much deeper than protecting the floor. It creates a boundary. Imagine Kenji arriving home on a rainy evening. A bag of groceries hangs from one hand. His phone is vibrating in his pocket. His shoulders still carry the weight of a long train ride and a busy workday. He could answer the message. He could unpack the groceries first. He could keep thinking about tomorrow's meeting. Instead, before any of that happens, his shoes come off. The action takes only a few seconds. Yet those few seconds quietly separate two different worlds. Outside those shoes are deadlines, crowded trains, responsibilities, conversations, and expectations. Inside the house is something different. Family, recovery, slower conversations, a different rhythm of life. That doorway becomes more than an entrance. It becomes a place where one part of the day is allowed to end before another begins. Many of us do the opposite. We walk through the front door, but mentally, we're still answering emails. We're replaying meetings. We're worrying about tomorrow. Our bodies arrive home, but our minds are still sitting at the office. That's why this habit is so powerful. It reminds us that transitions matter. Psychologists have suggested that physical boundaries and repeated routines can help signal to the brain that one context has ended and another has begun. Whether it's taking off your shoes, hanging up your coat, or pausing for a single deep breath, these small rituals can become quiet markers between different parts of life. So here's a simple question worth asking yourself. When you come home, what enters first? Your body or your stress? Perhaps a doorway is not simply where one room ends and another begins. Perhaps it's where one version of you is finally allowed to stop. And only a few minutes later, Kenji performs another quiet ritual, one that lasts just a few seconds, but changes the way he experiences an ordinary meal. A few moments after taking off his shoes, Kenji sits down for dinner. Before he picks up his chopsticks, before he takes the first bite, he quietly says a single word: itadakimasu. If you've ever visited Japan, you've probably heard it countless times. It's often translated as, "I humbly receive." The phrase expresses gratitude for the meal, respect for the people who prepared it, and an acknowledgement of the lives and effort that brought the food to the table. Those meanings are important. But if you watch closely, something else is happening. Kenji isn't only thanking someone, he's arriving. The word lasts only a second or two, yet those few seconds create a small pause between everything that came before and everything that is about to happen next. In many ways, itadakimasu acts like a piece of mental punctuation. It isn't simply the beginning of eating, it's a full stop at the end of the day that came before the meal. Think about how many dinners happen very differently. A phone is still in one hand. The television is playing in the background. Someone is replying to emails. Another person is replaying an argument from work. Some people barely notice the first bite because their attention never actually arrives at the table. The body is eating. The mind is somewhere else. Kenji's small pause gently brings those two back together. It's a little like closing one document before opening another. You aren't changing the computer. You're simply giving it permission to finish one task before beginning the next. Of course, Saying itadakimasu is not a magical formula, nor does the word itself guarantee any specific psychological effect. Its value may lie in something much simpler. A repeated moment of intentional attention. A quiet reminder that one part of the day has ended and another has begun. Perhaps that's why such a tiny ritual can feel surprisingly meaningful. Presence is rarely something we suddenly discover. More often, it's something we quietly practice, one small pause at a time. And the next habit asks something even more unusual. It invites the mind to spend time without filling every moment with stimulation. For many of us, that may be the hardest habit of all. The fourth habit may be the most difficult one for modern life to understand. From time to time, Kenji goes for a walk, not to close his exercise rings, not to count steps, not to improve his pace. He isn't trying to reach a destination. He isn't listening to a podcast. He isn't catching up on phone calls. Most days, he doesn't even carry his phone in his hand. He's simply walking. At first, that sounds almost unproductive. We've become so accustomed to filling every empty moment that walking without a purpose can feel like wasting time. But perhaps that's exactly why it matters. Researchers have long been interested in what happens when the brain is not focused on a demanding external task. During these quieter moments, networks involved in reflection and internal processing, often discussed as part of the brain's default mode network, may become more active. Rather than solving the problem directly in front of you, the mind may begin doing something different. It reviews experiences, connects memories, organizes unfinished thoughts, allows emotions that have been pushed aside to gently surface. Sometimes, it even discovers solutions you weren't consciously searching for. Imagine Kenji walking past the same neighborhood grocery store he has passed hundreds of times. Nothing remarkable happens. No exciting conversation, no dramatic insight, just familiar streets, the sound of bicycles passing, a breeze moving through the trees. And because nothing outside is demanding his attention, his mind finally has room to process everything that did. That kind of quiet space has become surprisingly rare. Today, silence is one of the most commercially valuable spaces in your life. Companies compete to occupy it. While you're waiting, walking, commuting, standing in line, eating alone, even during the final few minutes before you fall asleep. The moment your attention becomes available, something is ready to claim it. That doesn't mean podcasts are bad, or music, or audiobooks. They can all enrich our lives in meaningful ways. The problem begins when every unstructured moment disappears. When the mind never has the chance to simply wander. Many people say they feel uncomfortable walking without something playing in their ears. But perhaps that feeling isn't boredom at all. Perhaps it's your mind slowly adjusting to the return of its own attention. A quiet walk is not empty time. It's one of the few moments left that your brain hasn't been asked to rent out, and the next habit builds on that same idea. Not by adding more to your day, but by helping your mind finally finish it. At first glance, these 4 habits don't seem to have much in common. Stopping before you're completely full, taking off your shoes at the door, saying itadakimasu before a meal, going for a walk with no destination. They seem like separate customs, small traditions that happen to exist in the same culture. But if you step back for a moment, a different picture begins to appear. None of these habits is really about food, or shoes, or walking. They're all doing the same quiet job. Each one places a small boundary exactly where modern life usually has none. Hara Hachi Bu, creates a boundary around consumption. It teaches the mind that enough doesn't have to be decided by an empty plate. Removing your shoes creates a boundary between environments. The outside world is allowed to stay outside for a while. Itadakimasu creates a boundary between activities. It gives your attention permission to leave the last task before beginning the next one. And an unstructured walk creates a boundary around attention itself. For a little while, your mind no longer has to react to every sound, every notification, every demand, different habits, the same purpose. When you look at them together, something surprising becomes clear. None of these habits is trying to make Kenji mentally tougher. They're quietly preventing his attention from being pulled apart in the first place. That's a very different approach to discipline. Modern culture often assumes the answer is to become stronger, push harder, focus longer, develop more willpower. But what if the real solution isn't becoming stronger? What if it's creating fewer moments that require strength at all? Maybe that's why so many people feel exhausted before the day is even over. Not because they're weak, not because they lack character, but because their attention has been asked to cross too many invisible boundaries without ever being given the chance to reset. Maybe you are not struggling because you lack discipline. Maybe your day simply contains too few boundaries and far too many open doors. That single idea changes the way you see every habit we've talked about so far, because discipline may not begin with forcing yourself to do more. It may begin by quietly deciding where one part of your life ends before the next one begins. And the next 3 habits take that same idea even further. They bring those invisible boundaries into the 3 places that shape almost every day of your life: rest, work, and sleep. By the time dinner is over, Kenji doesn't collapse onto the couch. He doesn't leave the dishes for tomorrow. He doesn't walk away from the kitchen thinking, "I'll deal with it later." Instead, he spends less than a minute restoring a little order. A bowl goes back into the cabinet. A cloth wipes the kitchen counter. A towel is folded. Anything obvious that can be finished in a few seconds is quietly finished. Then he makes himself a cup of tea. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a tidy habit. But once again, something deeper is happening. Psychologists have long observed that unfinished tasks often remain mentally active, a phenomenon commonly known as the Zeigarnik effect. When something is left incomplete, the mind may continue treating it as unfinished business, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly in the background. An unfinished task is a little like a browser tab that isn't making any sound. You stop noticing it's there, yet it continues using memory. 1 tab rarely matters. 20 tabs eventually do. Perhaps that's why so many people stop working without ever feeling that the day has actually ended. Their bodies leave the task. Their attention doesn't. Kenji isn't trying to create a spotless house. He isn't deep cleaning every evening. He isn't chasing perfection. He's simply closing the small loops that would otherwise follow him into rest. Imagine him wiping the counter before sitting down with his tea. The action takes less than a minute. Nothing about the room looks dramatically different. But when he finally sits down, something has changed. The kitchen is no longer asking him to stand back up. The room has stopped making requests. And without realizing it, his mind becomes a little quieter too. Perhaps that's the real purpose of the ritual, not to create a perfect environment, but to create one that has stopped asking for another decision. Because rest doesn't begin the moment your body reaches the couch. Rest begins the moment your surroundings stop reminding you of everything that still needs to be done. And the next habit protects something just as valuable. A resource most of us spend every day without ever realizing how quickly it's disappearing. The sixth habit isn't about working harder. It's about working with your attention instead of constantly pulling it apart. Watch Kenji for a day, and you'll notice something that feels almost unusual now. When he eats, he eats. When he walks, he walks. When someone is speaking, he listens. And when he's working, he gives his attention to the task in front of him before moving to the next. It sounds almost too simple to be worth mentioning. Yet in today's world, it has become surprisingly uncommon. Many of us have learned to wear multitasking like a badge of honor. We answer emails while sitting in meetings. We check our phones in the middle of conversations. We eat lunch while scrolling through the news. We jump from one browser tab to another, convinced that staying busy means we're being productive. But those two things are not always the same. Multitasking often feels fast because so many things appear to be moving. Messages are answered. Tabs are opened. Calls are interrupted. Notifications disappear. From the outside, it looks like progress, but movement is not the same as completion. Researchers have found that every time we rapidly switch our attention from one task to another, the brain pays a small mental cost. The interruption may last only a moment. But the attention left behind doesn't always disappear as quickly. A half-written email lingers in the back of your mind. An interrupted conversation quietly asks to be finished. An unfinished idea keeps returning when you're trying to focus on something else. One open loop becomes another, then another. Eventually, it isn't just your work that feels fragmented. You begin to feel fragmented too. Kenji understands something many of us have forgotten. Attention is not unlimited. Every unnecessary switch spends a little more of it. That's why he doesn't protect his attention, because every task is equally important. He protects it because attention is the resource every meaningful task depends on. When your attention stays in one place, your work becomes calmer. Your conversations become deeper. Even simple moments begin to feel more complete. Of course, life doesn't always allow perfect single tasking. Parents are interrupted. Emergencies happen. Workplaces demand flexibility. The goal isn't perfection. It's becoming aware of how often we divide our attention without realizing what it costs. Perhaps real productivity isn't about fitting more things into each hour. Perhaps it's about allowing one moment to be fully finished before asking your mind to begin the next. But protecting attention is only part of the story. The mind also depends on something even more fundamental, its biological rhythm, and that brings us to the final habit. The final habit may be the one that supports all the others. Most people believe discipline creates a consistent sleep schedule. Wake up early because you're disciplined. Go to bed on time because you're disciplined. Stick to a routine because you have enough self-control. But what if we've been looking at it backwards? What if a consistent sleep schedule helps create the very conditions that discipline depends on? For Kenji, bedtime is rarely a daily negotiation. He doesn't stay up simply because one more episode starts playing, or because one more email arrives, or because there's nothing on the calendar forcing him to sleep. Most evenings, he goes to bed at roughly the same time. Most mornings, he wakes up at roughly the same time. Not because life is perfectly predictable, but because his body has learned a rhythm it can recognize. Researchers have long understood that our bodies run on internal biological clocks, often described through the body's circadian rhythm. That rhythm influences much more than sleep. It helps shape when we naturally feel alert, when we become tired, and how prepared the brain is for focus, attention, and self-regulation. When that rhythm becomes unpredictable, ordinary decisions can begin to feel surprisingly difficult. The alarm feels heavier. Small frustrations feel larger. Hunger becomes harder to ignore. Distractions become more tempting. patience becomes shorter, and many people blame their character for what may be, at least in part, simple fatigue. That doesn't mean life always allows perfect consistency. Parents with young children know that. People working night shifts know that. Caregivers know that. Health conditions can change everything. The goal isn't to create a morally perfect routine. The goal is to give your body a rhythm it can begin to trust. Even a little more consistency can make tomorrow's decisions feel lighter than today's. Perhaps that's one of the biggest lessons Kenji has been teaching us all along. His consistency is not simply evidence that he's disciplined. It may also be one of the quiet systems producing that discipline every single day. And when you look back at all 7 habits together, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. None of them asks Kenji to fight himself harder. Instead, they quietly create a life where fewer battles need to be fought at all. Now, take one step back and look at all 7 habits together. At first, they seem unrelated. Leaving one last bite on the plate, taking off your shoes at the door, saying itadakimasu before a meal, walking without a destination, restoring a little order before sitting down, doing one thing at a time, going to bed, and waking up on a steady rhythm. 7 small habits, 7 ordinary moments, but beneath the surface, they're all teaching the same lesson. Hara Hachi Bu teaches the ability to stop before excess. Removing your shoes creates a boundary between one environment and the next. Itadakimasu creates a pause before moving into a new activity. A quiet walk protects attention that doesn't need to be claimed by the outside world. Tidying before rest closes the mental loops that would otherwise follow you into the evening. Single tasking protects the attention every meaningful task depends on. And a consistent sleep schedule strengthens the biological foundation that makes all the others easier to sustain. Different habits. One philosophy. None of them asks Kenji to make ordinary life harder in the name of discipline. Instead, they quietly make ordinary life clearer. So discipline is needed less often. That's a very different way of thinking. We often imagine discipline as a constant battle between who we are and who we wish we could become. But these habits suggest something else. Maybe lasting discipline isn't built through endless self-control. Maybe it's built through thoughtful design. A small boundary becomes a repeated behavior. Repeated behavior reduces friction. Less friction allows the behavior to become more automatic. Automatic behavior slowly shapes identity. And over time, identity becomes character. Notice something important. These habits do not belong exclusively to Japan, and not every Japanese person practices them in the same way. The value isn't in copying another culture one habit at a time. The value is in recognizing what these habits quietly reveal about the design of everyday life. They remind us that our environment is never neutral. It is either helping our attention or quietly pulling it apart. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. The most disciplined life may not be the one with the most rules. It may simply be the one with the fewest daily negotiations. A life where the best choice doesn't always require the strongest will, because it has quietly become the easiest choice to make. Now, before you try to remember all 7 habits, I'd like to suggest something much smaller. Don't change your life this week. Don't try to become more disciplined overnight. Just run a simple experiment. 3 evenings. That's all. On the first night, eat exactly as you normally would. But as you reach the final few bites, pause for a moment. If it feels comfortable and appropriate, leave the very last bite behind. Not because the food is bad, not because one bite will change your health. Simply notice what happens inside your mind. Does your body still need the food? Or does your mind simply want the feeling of finishing? On the second night, create a small arrival ritual. When you come home, take off your shoes with intention. Put your phone down for just 1 minute. Take one slow breath before walking into the next room. Then ask yourself a simple question. Did your body arrive home before your mind did? Or was part of you still carrying work, emails, worries, and unfinished conversations through the front door? On the third night, close one small loop before you rest. Clear one surface. Put away 3 things. Prepare the room where you'll spend the evening. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're not cleaning the house. You're simply giving your mind fewer unfinished conversations with the room around you. Then sit down. Notice what feels different. Did the room become quieter, or did your mind? And here's the important part. You are not testing whether you're a disciplined person. You are testing something much more interesting. Whether a small change in structure can quietly reduce friction, whether tiny boundaries can make ordinary decisions feel just a little lighter. Because if they can, then perhaps discipline has never been about becoming someone new. Perhaps it has always been about making life a little easier to live, one small decision at a time. Now, let's go back to where we began. It's Tuesday morning in Kyoto, 5:43 a.m. Kenji opens his eyes just before the alarm. The apartment is still quiet. The kettle will be on in a moment. Soon, he'll wrap both hands around the same warm cup of tea. Nothing extraordinary has happened. No life-changing breakthrough. No dramatic transformation. No single decision that suddenly turned him into a disciplined person. And that's exactly the point. We often imagine that our lives change through big moments, a new job, a major setback, a life-changing book, a promise made on New Year's Day. Those moments matter, but they rarely shape us by themselves. More often, our lives are quietly shaped by what becomes ordinary, by the things we repeat when no one is watching. 20 years from now, no one will remember the bite you chose not to eat. They won't remember the shoes you removed at the front door, the quiet walk through your neighborhood, or the kitchen counter you wiped before sitting down. Those moments are too small to impress anyone, but they were never trying to impress anyone. They were quietly shaping the person who was living them, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. And one day, people may look at you and say something they've probably said about someone like Kenji. You always seem so calm. You never seem rushed. You make difficult things look easy. What they won't see are the thousands of invisible decisions that slowly disappeared from your life. They'll think you're naturally disciplined, that you've always been that way. And in one sense, they'll be wrong, because discipline wasn't born in a single moment. It wasn't created by one perfect morning or one burst of motivation. It was built quietly, repeatedly, on ordinary Tuesdays that looked exactly like this one. Perhaps that's the real secret we've been exploring all along. Your life doesn't change because a habit looks impressive. It changes because that habit quietly becomes part of an ordinary day. Because in the end, the habits that shape your future are rarely the ones that make the biggest noise. They're the ones that become so familiar, you no longer notice you're doing them. And that may be the most beautiful thing about discipline. The day it finally becomes invisible is the day it has truly become part of who you are. Before you leave, I'd like to ask you for one small favor. Not for this channel, for yourself. Don't try all 7 habits at once. You don't need to change your entire life this week. Just try the 3-night experiment. 3 ordinary evenings. Nothing more. On the first night, practice stopping. On the second, create a simple arrival ritual when you come home. On the third, close one small loop before you sit down to rest, then don't ask yourself, did I become more disciplined? Ask a different question. Which night made the next morning feel just a little lighter? Sometimes the smallest changes reveal the biggest truths. If one of those 3 evenings changes the way you feel the next morning, come back and tell us which one it was. I genuinely love to hear your experience. And if someone in your life always seems exhausted, someone who keeps trying to solve every problem by pushing harder, share this video with them, because they may not need more motivation. They may not need stronger willpower. They may simply need a little less friction in their day. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next video.